Imagine standing on a factory rooftop in central Russia, shouting for the wages you've already earned, only to be ignored by the management and the state. This isn't an isolated scene, but part of a growing crisis that defines the collapse of Russia's industrial base in 2025. Across the nation, unpaid wages have surged past 1.6 billion rubles, nearly triple the previous year, and the number continues to climb. Officially, these are temporary delays. In reality, they mark the unraveling of a war economy stretched to its limits. The unpaid wage crisis is spreading from oil and gas to construction metals and transportation industries, once considered the backbone of Putin's economic resilience. Workers from Murmansk to Vladivostok are going months without pay. In one striking case, more than 60 employees at a power plant in the Urals climbed onto the roof and threatened to jump unless they were paid immediately. Their wages, worth about 4 months of survival, had simply vanished in the fog of corruption and sanctions. Local police surrounded the building, but no one arrested the executives responsible. Behind these individual tragedies lies a deeper structural failure. Western sanctions have cut off Russia's access to high-value exports and technology. The United States, under President Donald Trump, has tightened restrictions on Russian financial assets and energy transactions, while European markets continue to block critical imports. The Russian ruble has lost nearly half its value since early 2024, and the central bank has been forced to burn through reserves just to stabilize it. The result, an economy in free fall concealed behind patriotic slogans and manipulated statistics. At the center of this collapse stands Russia's working class, the very people Putin once promised to protect. In Moscow, the elite still dine in high-end restaurants and discuss contracts over imported wine. In Siberia and the Far East, however, miners and factory workers face a very different reality. The social perspective reveals a widening chasm between Russia's wealthy core and its impoverished periphery. In Buryatia, Dagestan, and Tuva regions already devastated by war casualties, wage arrears have hit record highs. These areas, dominated by ethnic minorities, provide both the manpower for the front lines and the cheap labor for the collapsing domestic industries. They bear the double burden of dying for Moscow's wars and starving for its factories. The statistics tell a brutal story. More than 1/3 of Russia's enterprises are now unprofitable. And in nearly 70 of the country's 89 regions, local budgets are running dry. Officials scramble to pay teachers, doctors, and railway workers, often resorting to short-term loans or emergency funds. In the industrial heartlands of Chelyabinsk and Perm, entire production lines have been halted. Some workers now sleep inside factories to avoid paying for transportation or rent. From an economic standpoint, Russia's unpaid wage wave mirrors the early warning signs of a systemic collapse. Economists inside the Russian central bank, speaking anonymously, describe a chain of defaults waiting to unfold. Once a factory misses payroll, it triggers a ripple effect through its suppliers and subcontractors, eventually freezing entire regional economies. Even large corporations like Arosa, the diamond giant, have begun to shut down operations and furlough workers. Yet the Kremlin's response has been predictable blame shifting and repression. Prosecutors target individual plant managers for corruption, portraying them as scapegoats to distract from the structural rot. State TV continues to claim that Western sanctions are failing, while quietly acknowledging temporary difficulties in industrial output. But the political perspective reveals something deeper. Small, localized protests are emerging. Telegram channels in Ural towns circulate videos of unpaid workers confronting local officials. Women, mothers, wives, and nurses form quiet circles of dissent, demanding the government honor its promises. They're not calling for revolution, just for bread salaries and dignity. At the same time, the demographic cost of this crisis is growing. Younger, skilled Russians, engineers, programmers, technicians are leaving the country in record numbers. The demographic perspective calls this the double bleeding of Russia's human capital, the loss of life at the front lines, and the flight of its intellectual base. As a result, even factories that manage to stay open can't find qualified workers. Russia's war economy is now eating itself from within. What began as a patriotic drive to outlast the West has become a desperate struggle to keep the lights on. Each delayed paycheck, each protest, and each worker's suicide erodes the illusion of control that Putin has built for 2 decades. The question that looms over the nation is not whether the collapse will come, but how violently it will unfold. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the Kremlin's propaganda machine promised that the war would strengthen the nation's economy, that sanctions would be a temporary inconvenience, and that new alliances with China, India, and the global South would compensate for Western losses. For a while, it seemed to work. Factories in Tatarstan and Nizhny Novgorod ramped up production for the defense industry. Average incomes rose slightly in 2023 as soldiers, contractors, and arms workers received large bonuses. Moscow broadcast this as proof that Russia had adapted. But what the government called a miracle was merely an illusion, one built on military spending, unpaid labor, and the depletion of reserves. By 2024, this war economy began to buckle. Russia's official unemployment rate hit a record low of 2.1%, which the Kremlin presented as a triumph. In reality, it was a mirage, not because jobs were plentiful, but because millions of men had been mobilized, wounded, or killed. Factories could no longer fill vacancies, and service sectors were crippled by a lack of qualified workers. The demographic perspective exposes this distortion. The war has drained Russia's youth, both on the battlefield and through mass emigration. The result is a generational void that will haunt the country for decades, undermining productivity, pension stability, and innovation. Meanwhile, economic data shows the cost of maintaining this illusion. The central bank was forced to hike interest rates to 21% in 2024, the highest in 2 decades, in an attempt to curb inflation. That decision choked the private sector. Companies that depended on cheap credit to pay workers or purchase raw materials suddenly faced loan payments up to 70% higher. In a single year, industrial production dropped by 15% outside of defense manufacturing. Steel and timber exports plummeted due to shrinking global demand, while domestic consumption fell as wages stagnated. The economic miracle turned out to be a state-subsidized sugar rush, short-lived and deadly in the long term. The social perspective adds another layer to this collapse. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, luxury malls still operate, and the wealthy continue importing Western goods through gray markets. But in places like Buryatia and Kemerovo, families depend on a single factory for their livelihood. When that factory stops paying, the entire town goes dark. Children go hungry, and pensioners sell their belongings to buy food. For these regions, the war has become a class war, a brutal extraction system, where poor and minority communities bear the economic and human cost for the Kremlin's geopolitical ambitions. The scale of inequality is staggering. Studies from Russian labor unions estimate that the top 10% of earners largely concentrated in major cities, and the defense elite now control over 70% of the nation's liquid wealth. In contrast, rural households in Dagestan and Altai live below subsistence level, surviving on delayed pensions or remittances. The government's silence is appalling, as one independent economist put it. It's a silence that reveals the moral bankruptcy of a regime that has traded its people's future for short-term military glory. But perhaps the most fragile part of this war economy is the psychological one, the belief that the state will always step in to stabilize things. That belief is breaking down fast. Even defense sector workers, once the pride of the nation, have started reporting wage cuts and furloughs. Civil servants in regional capitals now whisper about missed salary payments and shrinking budgets. The Kremlin can no longer afford to buy loyalty at the same rate it once did. The political perspective shows that small protests, though scattered, are beginning to form a network of quiet defiance. Telegram groups share legal advice on how to file complaints about unpaid wages without triggering repression. In Ufa and Novosibirsk, local journalists defy censorship to cover economic grievances, framing them not as political acts, but as survival stories. Mothers and wives of mobilized soldiers, many of them from poor ethnic backgrounds, have become the moral conscience of this decaying system. Their grief amplified online bypasses propaganda and chips away at the myth of unity. What makes these women so powerful is their authenticity. They don't demand regime change. They demand fairness. But in a system built on lies, fairness itself becomes revolutionary. Their soft pressure represents a new kind of resistance, one that the Kremlin cannot easily crush without revealing its own fear. As the illusion of prosperity fades and the costs of war mount, Russia's economic machinery faces a paradox: it must keep producing to sustain the war, but the very act of sustaining the war is what's destroying its ability to produce. How long can this contradiction last before the system implodes from within? By early 2025, the cracks in Russia's industrial foundation had become fissures. Entire regions that once powered the nation's economy were now struggling to survive. The country's industrial breakdown was no longer theoretical. It was visible, measurable, and spreading like wildfire. From the frozen mines of Kuzbas to the plywood mills of Western Siberia, production lines have gone silent, their machines rusting while workers wait for pay that may never come. One region after another began collapsing under its own economic weight. In the Komi Republic, where mining had long been the main source of revenue, tax income dropped by more than 50% within months. Chelyabinsk, once a proud manufacturing hub, saw its regional revenues fall by 1/3. The result was catastrophic. Local governments couldn't afford basic services. Teachers went unpaid. Clinics ran out of medicine. Towns that had once thrived on steel, coal, or lumber now resembled ghost settlements. The social perspective reveals that these were not isolated failures. They were the result of an unequal system that treated Russia's vast periphery as expendable. While Moscow's skyline gleams with new construction thousands of kilometers away, the Siberian heartland is sinking. Workers from poor remote towns, many of them ethnic minorities, are trapped in an impossible cycle: unpaid wages, shrinking welfare, and no chance of relocation. In Dagestan, families whose sons died at the front now face starvation. The state offers medals instead of compensation. The Kremlin's appalling silence toward these regions has created an invisible humanitarian crisis hidden beneath the facade of patriotism. Factories that survived the first shock of sanctions are now dying from within. The cause isn't sabotage or lack of will. It's the crushing combination of high interest rates, falling demand, and supply chain collapse. With the central bank's benchmark rate hovering around 20%, borrowing costs have soared beyond reach. Small businesses simply can't sustain operations. Industrial giants like Autovos, Russia's largest car maker, have resorted to 4-day work weeks, cutting wages by 20% to avoid mass layoffs. Truck maker KAMAZ and the Gorky auto plant followed suit. But these temporary fixes are running out of road. The demographic perspective makes this decline even more alarming. Russia's working-age population continues to shrink due to both mobilization and mass migration. In 2025 alone, an estimated 900,000 skilled professionals, engineers, IT experts, and technicians have fled the country. Those who remain are either overworked or underpaid. The double bleeding of human capital has left factories without the brains or hands needed to recover. Even defense-related industries are suffering from a shortage of qualified workers, forcing companies to hire untrained laborers at higher wages, which paradoxically worsens inflation. The cascading factory closures are rippling across entire communities. Take the case of the Svetsa plywood mill in western Siberia, where over 300 workers were suddenly dismissed without warning. Overnight, the local economy disintegrated. The town's small stores closed within weeks, and property values collapsed. It's a grim echo of the post-Soviet 1990s when unpaid wages and hunger protests dominated national headlines. Yet unlike the 1990s, today's crisis comes after 2 decades of Putin's promise of stability, a promise now visibly broken. The Kremlin has tried to contain the fallout by tightening political control. But even repression has its limits. Local governors face growing pressure to prevent unrest, yet they lack the funds to deliver real solutions. Some have quietly requested emergency subsidies from Moscow to pay back wages. But the federal budget itself is stretched thin by the ongoing war effort. Russia's defense expenditures in the first half of 2025 alone exceeded 8.5 trillion rubles, around $100 billion, leaving little for civilian bailouts. The political perspective suggests a dangerous pattern emerging beneath the surface. Instead of direct protests, Russians are resorting to subtle acts of defiance. Workers leak videos of empty factory floors. Regional administrators falsify reports to hide bankruptcies. Local journalists quietly document wage arrears despite censorship threats. What was once open rebellion in the 1990s has evolved into something quieter, but potentially more destabilizing, a culture of passive resistance that corrodes authority from the inside. Even China, Russia's supposed strategic ally, has become part of this industrial collapse. Beijing continues to buy Russian coal oil and steel, but only at rock-bottom prices. Simultaneously, Chinese firms flood the Russian market with cheap goods, undermining domestic producers. Analysts now warn that Russia is trading one form of dependence for another. What began as an economic partnership has turned into a slow economic colonization. The industrial breakdown reveals a truth that state propaganda can no longer hide. Russia's war economy is a pyramid built on fear, debt, and denial. Each factory closure, each unpaid wage chips away at the foundation of Putin's empire. If these trends continue, the collapse will not come from the battlefield, but from the silent factories and abandoned towns of his own country. By the spring of 2025, Russia's social fabric had begun to unravel. The economic collapse was no longer confined to factory gates. It was spreading into schools, hospitals, and homes. Teachers in the Tula region reported going 3 months without pay. Nurses in provincial clinics quietly walked out, while pensioners queued outside local banks, hoping to withdraw their overdue stipends. What began as an industrial breakdown was morphing into a broader social crisis, one that strikes at the heart of Russia's stability. Underneath the silence lies rage. Across small towns in Siberia and Dagestan and along the Volga River, people whisper about betrayal. The social perspective reveals the deep fracture between the powerful core of Russia, Moscow, and St. Petersburg, and the forgotten periphery. The capital's elites continue to enjoy imported luxuries and political insulation, while the countryside bears the full weight of sanctions, inflation, and war. For those in remote republics, the feeling is clear: they are both the backbone and the burden of Russia's empire. This divide is not just economic, it's ethnic and generational. The republics of Buryatia and Dagestan have seen disproportionately high mobilization and casualty rates. In some rural villages, Nearly every household has lost a son or brother at the front. The Kremlin's appalling silence in the face of this suffering has become an open wound. Social networks overflow with grief and anger, not political manifestos, but emotional appeals. When will Moscow care about us? That question is spreading faster than propaganda can suppress it. Telegram channels run by wives and mothers of mobilized soldiers have become hubs of emotional resistance. They post photos of loved ones missing in action, name corrupt recruiters, and share uncensored footage of funerals. These women aren't politicians, they are voices of conscience. And yet their moral authority poses a profound threat to the regime. The political perspective calls this phenomenon soft pressure. It's not violent, but it's relentless. The state can jail activists, but it cannot silence mothers who demand to know why their children died for lies. In one recent example, a group of mothers from the Irkutsk region gathered outside the regional administration building, holding signs that read, "We gave you our sons. Give us the truth." Local police stood frozen, unsure whether to disperse the group or avoid provoking sympathy. Within hours, the footage went viral on Telegram and YouTube, viewed by over 2 million people before being censored. This kind of moral defiance is reshaping how Russians see power, not as something divine and untouchable, but as something deeply human, fragile, and unjust. The demographic perspective deepens the tragedy. The combination of war casualties and mass emigration has left entire towns without young men. Factories now rely on elderly workers or women taking on double shifts. Russia's double bleeding, the loss of youth to war and intellectuals to exile, is eroding its human foundation. Labor shortages plague both civilian and defense sectors. Even military recruiters admit they are running out of eligible men. The generational burden is growing heavier by the month, threatening to collapse pensions and critical infrastructure within the next decade. Meanwhile, discontent is bubbling up in subtler ways. Strikes are rare, most are too afraid, but absenteeism is rising sharply. Workers call in sick en masse, small businesses quietly underreport taxes, and bureaucrats drag their feet on orders from above. This passive defiance, though invisible on TV, represents a new kind of rebellion, one that dissolves authority not through confrontation, but through inertia. Russia's system depends on obedience. The moment people stop caring, it begins to rot. Adding to the despair is the moral hypocrisy that ordinary Russians now see every day. While state media glorifies patriotic sacrifice, oligarchs move their assets abroad, shielding families in Dubai or Cyprus. Investigative reports reveal that even as workers go unpaid, senior managers in state-owned firms receive bonuses worth millions of rubles. It's a bitter reminder that patriotism in Russia has always been a one-way street. The poor give, the rich take. The social erosion now facing Russia may not erupt in an instant. History shows that such crises simmer until they explode. The strikes of the 1990s began with unpaid coal miners blocking railways. Now the digital age provides new railways of resistance. Telegram, TikTok, and YouTube have become the Trans-Siberian of dissent, carrying stories of neglect from the periphery to the world. As the Kremlin tightens control, it may succeed in silencing individual protests, but it cannot suppress despair. The question is no longer whether Russia's people will reach a breaking point, but whether the regime can endure the moral collapse now unfolding beneath its economic one. For years, the Kremlin's propaganda portrayed Russia's defense sector as untouchable, the beating heart of the nation's power and pride. But by mid-2025, even that heart has started to falter. Once the symbol of economic endurance, the defense industry now shows the same symptoms that plague the rest of Russia's economy: wage arrears, shrinking orders, and silent disillusionment among workers. What was once the strongest pillar of Putin's war machine is beginning to crack under its own weight. In August 2025, Russia's deputy industry minister quietly confirmed what insiders had whispered for months. Salaries at arms factories were being cut by 10%, the first reduction since the war began. The announcement shocked a workforce that had been told they were indispensable. These are the same factories that churned out tanks, missiles, and drones around the clock industries that once represented the Kremlin's last economic refuge. The government's message had been clear. Work harder, earn more, serve your country. But now even that promise is collapsing. The demographic perspective explains why. The defense sector's labor base is exhausted. Many of its young men are either dead or deployed, and the next generation of engineers has fled abroad. Skilled machinists are retiring faster than they can be replaced, and technical universities are losing students to emigration. The double bleeding is hitting the defense economy at its core: fewer workers, lower quality, and rising costs. To fill the gap, companies have turned to untrained laborers from rural regions, accelerating mistakes and reducing output efficiency. At the same time, the government's vast defense spending, over 8.5 trillion rubles, $100 billion, in just the first half of 2025, has drained the national budget dry. Civilian sectors starve while military plants are told to do more with less. Russia's GDP growth, which once reached 4.3% in 2024, has slowed to barely 1% this year, and that number likely masks far worse realities outside of Moscow. When 30% of a nation's budget goes into weapons that can't secure victory, even loyalists begin to question the logic. Inside the factories, whispers of frustration are growing. Engineers in Tula complain that components now come from inferior suppliers after Western imports dried up. At Uralvagonzavod, the tank plant in Nizhny Tagil, managers have reportedly begun delaying payments to subcontractors. Workers there say they are paid late, sometimes in partial installments, a dangerous echo of the late 1990s when unpaid wages nearly broke the Russian state. The political perspective reveals a deeper problem. The Kremlin's authority over its industrial base is fraying. For 2 decades, Putin's system relied on loyalty bought through pay and protection. But once pay disappears, loyalty weakens. Some plant managers now openly defy government orders to maintain production targets, citing material shortages. Telegram channels used by defense workers, once full of patriotic slogans, have turned into forums of quiet complaint. "We were heroes last year," one worker wrote, "now we're beggars." The social perspective sharpens the picture of inequality. While factory workers suffer wage cuts, executives and connected oligarchs in Moscow continue to profit from inflated defense contracts. Investigations reveal that middlemen in the procurement chain pocket millions by reselling low-grade Chinese parts to the state at triple the price. These schemes mirror the corruption that drained the Soviet military in its final years, a system where greed thrived while soldiers starved. The workers who believed they were defending the motherland are realizing they were defending someone else's fortune. Meanwhile, China, ostensibly Russia's ally, is tightening its grip on this dependency. Chinese companies provide crucial components for drones and electronics, but dictate the terms. Beijing's leverage has allowed it to demand deep discounts on energy exports, while flooding the Russian market with its own cheap defense-related materials. What Moscow hails as strategic cooperation increasingly resembles economic subjugation. In effect, Russia's war machine has become China's supply chain extension. Experts warn that once the defense sector buckles, the psychological impact could be irreversible. It's the one industry Russians still associate with national pride. If arms factories begin to close, the symbolic collapse will hit harder than any economic report. Even state media has subtly shifted tone, airing sentimental tributes to our struggling workers instead of boasting about production milestones, a quiet admission that the myth of resilience is wearing thin. And yet, despite the cracks, Putin's regime continues to pour resources into this black hole. Analysts suggest the Kremlin fears that cutting defense spending outright could spark massive layoffs and with them unrest. But the paradox is obvious. The very spending meant to preserve stability is now accelerating collapse. Russia's war machine may still roar, but its gears are grinding on empty. The defense industry's decline is more than an economic story. It's the unraveling of the narrative that sustained Putin's rule. For 2 decades, he sold Russians the idea that strength equals stability. Now, as the assembly lines slow and the paychecks stop, that illusion is disintegrating. When the factories that built the empire begin to fail, how long before the empire itself follows? By late 2025, the illusion of stability that Vladimir Putin had cultivated for more than 2 decades was collapsing under its own contradictions. On television, anchors still praised resilience under pressure, but in the streets of Yekaterinburg, Kazan, and Vladivostok, ordinary Russians faced empty pay envelopes, shuttered shops, and rising despair. The Kremlin's economic narrative, built on wartime spending and fear, was reaching its breaking point. What began as a financial crisis had evolved into a social implosion and a silent political reckoning. The Russian government insists that everything is under control. Official statements highlight temporary wage delays and regional management issues, not systemic collapse. But independent analysts inside Russia's central bank quietly warn that the crisis is far deeper. Roughly 1 in 3 enterprises is now unprofitable. More than 2/3 of the country's regions have already spent their annual budgets. Local officials scramble to borrow money to pay teachers and doctors, while Moscow demands that they maintain social stability at any cost. The Kremlin's strategy, once again, is to paper over cracks rather than repair the foundations. The political perspective exposes how this deception functions. To deflect blame, Putin's administration has begun prosecuting factory directors and local mayors, presenting them as corrupt saboteurs. In reality, these are scapegoats meant to preserve the myth that the system itself still works. This familiar tactic, sacrifice the few to protect the narrative, reflects a regime more concerned with optics than outcomes. But even loyal bureaucrats now whisper doubts. Telegram channels frequented by mid-level officials report growing unease. If we can't pay people, one wrote, how long before they stop listening? Simultaneously, the social perspective reveals a growing sense of betrayal. In small towns from Karelia to the Far East, Russians see no difference between oligarchs and the state. They are one and the same. The gap between Moscow's glittering skyline and the decaying periphery has never been wider. While elites escape sanctions through offshore accounts and private jets, millions of citizens line up at food markets to buy flour and potatoes on credit. The war, once sold as a patriotic duty, has become an instrument of class oppression. Ethnic minorities and rural populations, who provide most of the soldiers and laborers, are realizing they are fighting for an empire that treats them as expendable. The demographic perspective adds a grim, long-term warning. Russia's population has shrunk by nearly 2 million since the invasion began, a combination of war deaths, low birth rates, and mass emigration. Analysts describe a generational collapse underway, too few young people to replace the dead or the departed, too few skilled professionals to rebuild what's been lost. The labor shortages in mining, manufacturing, and healthcare are not temporary, they are structural. Even if the war ended tomorrow, it would take decades to reverse the damage. As the economic and demographic decline deepens, social pressure is mounting in unpredictable ways. Russia's history shows that revolutions rarely begin with politics. They begin with hunger and humiliation. In several regions, groups of unpaid workers have staged sit-ins demanding back wages. In Tatarstan, some have gone on hunger strikes. Mothers of fallen soldiers travel to Moscow to confront military recruiters, their quiet defiance spreading across Telegram and YouTube despite censorship. These are not organized opposition movements. They are raw expressions of exhaustion, and that makes them dangerous. The Kremlin's response oscillates between denial and panic. Some regions receive emergency stability payments to clear wage arrears. Others see sudden visits by federal inspectors and televised gestures of compassion. Putin himself occasionally announces bonuses for military families or promises to review the wage situation. But these symbolic acts only buy time. The structural decay, what economists call the implosion of real productivity, continues to accelerate. Experts warn that Russia is entering a self-perpetuating downward spiral. Economic contraction leads to wage arrears, which fuel social discontent, which forces the state to spend even more on repression, deepening the fiscal crisis. The very tools Putin uses to preserve control are now hastening his downfall. A former government advisor put it bluntly, "This is not the end of the regime, but it is the end of its legitimacy." And yet the system persists because fear still works. Many Russians are too weary, too isolated, or too dependent on the state to rebel. Propaganda remains powerful, offering simple scapegoats, the West Ukraine corrupt local officials. But propaganda cannot feed families or replace lost sons. The emotional endurance of the Russian people, once the regime's greatest asset, is eroding. As one factory worker from Novokuznetsk said in a leaked interview, "They told us to tighten our belts for the motherland. Now we are choking on it." In the end, Russia's collapse may not come with a bang, but with silence, the silence of factories that no longer hum, of teachers who no longer teach, of soldiers who no longer march. A slow-motion unraveling of a nation that mistook fear for strength. The empire that once demanded obedience is now sustained only by inertia. And the question hanging over every Russian household is no longer, will things get better, but how much longer can this go on? By 2025, Russia's economy is crumbling beneath the weight of sanctions, corruption, and the war in Ukraine. Unpaid wages, factory closures, and regional bankruptcies have shattered the illusion of Putin's resilient war economy. The social perspective exposes a widening divide between wealthy Moscow elites and impoverished regions like Buryatia and Dagestan, whose people bear the brunt of both battlefield casualties and economic collapse. The political perspective reveals growing cracks in Kremlin control as small moral protests by soldiers' mothers and unpaid workers challenge state narratives of stability. Meanwhile, the demographic perspective underscores a long-term catastrophe. Russia's population is shrinking, its workforce aging, and its intellectual base fleeing abroad. Even the once untouchable defense industry is faltering, plagued by wage cuts and corruption. China exploits Russia's desperation, tightening economic dependence. Despite propaganda and repression, public despair is spreading. The Kremlin can punish dissent, but cannot suppress hunger, grief, or fatigue. What began as a temporary economic slowdown has become an existential crisis, a slow disintegration of a nation's social, political, and demographic core. The question now is not if Putin's system will collapse, but when and what kind of Russia will remain when it does.